A grim haze hung across the skyline, filtering what remained of the sun's meager rays through a cloak of dust. The air had turned dangerous to breathe years ago, forcing people to rely on sealed buildings or filter masks whenever they stepped outside. A militarized authority, once born out of society's desperate scramble for survival, now doggedly controlled the planet's supply of oxygen canisters. No one called them by their official name anymore. They were the oxygen tyrants, uniformed soldiers who carried rifles and wore protective masks with tinted visors. Their ranks had grown over time, fortified by fearsome technology and a near monopoly on vital resources. Under their iron fist, the standard greeting was no longer a cordial handshake, but a suspicious gaze and a raised hand to point out precisely who held the canister and who did not. In the rubble of a once bustling city center, soot-covered walls bore faint traces of old graffiti. Air for all, freedom to breathe, down with the tyrants. Tens of thousands had gradually drifted away or succumbed to the suffocating fumes. Those who remained were either too defiant to leave or had nowhere better to go. Among these resilient few was a small rebellion that called itself Tomorrow's Breath. Its members met secretly whenever possible, often in the basement of a crumbling apartment building. It was during one of these clandestine meetings that Nari, a quiet but intense woman with short cropped hair and kind eyes, lifted a battered respirator piece to show the group. Nearby, an older man named Garrick observed, with arms folded across his chest. "This is our future," Nari said, her voice muffled by the cloth mask she'd slid aside, "a future of constant fear without oxygen. But it doesn't have to be this way." Her words were greeted by a hesitant silence. Any mention of challenging the oxygen tyrants ran the risk of infiltration or reprisal. Even the bravest among them spoke in whispers. Garrick broke the tense pause. "We've been tiptoeing around for years, scrounging for scraps, trying to dodge patrols just to stay alive. When do we say enough is enough?" Someone from the back, a slight teenager named Tio, made a fist around his flimsy mask. "We say it now," he whispered. "We don't want these so-called protectors controlling every breath that we take." He glanced around the group as though seeking approval. "I'd rather die fighting them than suffocating in the streets." Slowly heads nodded, carrying the weight of their collective exhaustion. It was no easy matter. The oxygen tyrants were ruthless. They confiscated any contraband canisters they discovered, hoarding them in massive, fortified warehouses guarded day and night. A direct assault seemed impossible, yet the spark had been lit. Tonight, they would plan a heist that could, if successful, shift the balance of power. Tomorrow's Breath would attempt to steal oxygen canisters en masse and redistribute them to the people. 8th. The next evening, under the veil of a new moon, the group gathered outside a dilapidated building near the edge of the city. They'd chosen the location because overhead swaths of thick black haze provided welcome cover from watchtowers. The plan was to reconvene there before setting out for the Tyrants' main depot, an imposing facility of concrete and steel built on what used to be docks along a drained riverbed. Its chain-link fences were electrified, the guard towers outfitted with harsh spotlights and armed patrols. Yet the building itself had ventilation ducts that occasionally spewed out steam. One rumor said the facility was so large that small squads could infiltrate sections undetected if they were quiet, quick, and lucky. Nari had spent her last few days gathering schematics of the depot, gleaned from a reluctant engineer who once serviced the building's backup generator. The engineer didn't want trouble but recognized the injustice of hoarded resources. From him, they'd learned of a tunnel which led beneath the facility, used to deliver fresh water to an aging filtration system. It was rarely visited nowadays, thanks to the steady decay of municipal infrastructure. With that knowledge, Nari's group felt a flicker of hope. Wearing improvised camouflage, the rebels broke into smaller teams. Each team carried a battered but functional gas detector. Oxygen could spike in odd pockets, and carbon-heavy deposits could snuff out unsuspecting rebels within minutes. They had promised to stay in constant communication using hand signals, since none dared risk speaking even a word in the tunnel. It was a nerve-wracking descent, carefully parting the corroded metal grate that covered the entrance, then moving into the pitch-black passageway. The only light came from tired headlamps taped over to emit faint beams. Dripping water sounded ominously from overhead pipes. As they advanced, a hush came over them. This was the moment of truth. For years they'd dreamed of challenging the oppressive hold the Tyrants had on the air, but few were bold enough to try. Many had lost friends or family to the respirator checks, when soldiers would appear unannounced, yank masks off suspected dissidents, and detain them for unlicensed oxygen usage. But now, the rebels advanced silently through the labyrinth, hearts pounding. This was their chance to uproot the system. For MASH. They navigated the tunnel for what felt like hours, ducking low beneath clusters of dangling cables that threatened to snag them. Occasionally, an echo of footsteps or the hiss of pressured vents from above would remind them how dangerously close they were to the guards. Finally, they arrived at a junction where the corridors split. Garrick motioned for them to halt. He extended a hand, tapping a small device on his belt. It showed a set of personnel movements inside the facility, courtesy of a signal they'd hacked from a watchtower's broad-range scanner. Although crude, the data gave them an approximate sense of guard rotations. Garrick traced his finger along the map etched in his mind and pointed left, indicating the water filtration chamber was in that direction. They slipped through a corroded door that groaned just enough to freeze them in place. The tension in that moment felt suffocating. Any misstep or noise might invite armed soldiers investigating the intrusion, but the door held and they moved on. Pipes lined the walls, reminiscent of metal veins carrying fluid across the belly of the oppressive structure. Within moments, they had reached the filtration chamber, a cavernous space dominated by a large reservoir. The water had a stagnant green tint, swirling with sludge that no one would ever willingly drink. Rusted catwalks circled the reservoir, leading to a locked door on the opposite side. Above them, metal rafters bristled with angular shadows. Nari gestured at Teo, handing him a slender crowbar. He and Garrick tiptoed to the locked door. Their motion was quick but careful, prying at hinges and bolts until the door gave way with a sharp metallic pop. Glancing over their shoulders, they heard only the hum of machinery. Satisfied that they were still undetected, the small group slipped through into a dimly lit corridor. On the far side, a sign read Storage Level 2 in faded letters. Suddenly, the sound of boots echoed. Two heavily armed guards were rounding a corner. One was checking a handheld meter, presumably scanning for radiation or atmospheric irregularities. Their presence forced the rebels to flatten themselves against the wall, hearts hammering in their chests. In that tight space, every shallow breath was precious, but the guards kept walking, the clang of their boots growing fainter. Once it seemed safe, Tomorrow's breath continued forward. Teo had always wondered what it would feel like to stand up to the uniformed regime that had tormented his family for so long. His parents had died because they couldn't afford enough oxygen to support his mother's compromised lungs. The Tyrants wouldn't grant more canisters without an official bond that would have indebted the family for generations. Refusing it meant no air. By the time an official permit was acquired through back channels, his mother could only draw one final breath. So Teo had vowed never again to watch someone suffocate when it was within his power to prevent it. At last, the rebels reached a broad corridor with motionless conveyor belts on each side. Metal crates stood stacked in neat rows, likely containing the canisters they saw. Signs labeled them with an intimidating red slash, "Authorized personnel only, O2, reserves." The group stilled, savoring the significance of this moment. They had arrived at the heart of the beast. However, even from a distance, it was clear this was not a simple hall. Security cameras swiveled in the corners, automated turrets perched near the ceiling. Though they were silent for now, the rebels knew any unauthorized movement might trigger an alarm. They couldn't risk it. Nari crouched, producing a small portable device that a sympathetic ex-soldier had supplied. She keyed in a few commands, hoping it would temporarily scramble the cameras. They'd tested it once on a dummy camera out in the field, and it worked for all of 15 seconds. That would have to suffice. Nari pressed the switch. A flicker of static danced across one camera. Its mechanism jerked, uncertain, as though fighting an invisible signal. Motioning to the others, Nari slipped into the room, staying low to reduce the chance of being detected. In swift motions, Teo crouched near the first stack of crates. He pried one open carefully, revealing rows of oxygen canisters. They were brand new, shining with a metallic glare under the overhead lights, each compressed to store hours, maybe days of breathable air. The rest of the rebels rushed to fill their packs or sling canisters over their shoulders. They had planned for this, bringing sturdy fabric satchels and even small carts. Garrick tapped his watch. They had mere seconds before the cameras might come back online, but that was more than enough time to pack away what they could. Excitement commingled with dread. They were on the verge of success, yet fully aware that one slip could spell disaster. They were nearly done when the overhead lights turned a sudden, menacing red. A siren wailed, high-pitched and unrelenting. "Scrambler shorting out!" Nari shouted, yanking the device from her belt. Smoke curled from its edges. Within seconds, an alarm barked across the loudspeakers. "Intruder alert! Secure the canisters! All units converge!" A moment of collective panic seized them, but Garrick rallied quickly. "We go back the way we came! Formation now!" The group hustled back down the corridor, canisters clanging in their bags, hearts pounding. Boots thundered behind them in the distance, accompanied by harsh shouts. The chase had begun. Shots echoed off concrete walls. Once they neared the filtration chamber, a barrage of bullets ricocheted, sending sparks raining down. The rebels ducked behind the catwalk rails, returning sporadic fire with salvage guns. One soldier leaped from a guard platform, rolling to a crouch before aiming. Nari lifted her sidearm, squeezed the trigger, and forced the soldier back into cover. Down in the reservoir, water churned with the frantic movements above. Another volley of bullets whizzed overhead. Above, a klaxon pulsed an eerie strobe effect across the catwalk. The rebels had no choice but to press forward. Teo took point, weaving between support beams, occasionally returning fire. Garrick stayed at the rear, ensuring no one was left behind. Their hands felt numb, half from terror and half from the suffocating sense of how close they were to losing everything. The entire operation balanced on a razor's edge. Reaching the corridor that led back to the tunnel, they encountered two black visor guards blocking the passage, rifles raised. One barked an order. "Stand down! Surrender your canisters!" Instantly, a volley of bullets hammered against the metal walls. The clang set ears ringing. One rebel, a middle-aged woman named Fari, took a shot directly to her mask's edge. She staggered, gasping for breath. Teo lunged forward, firing at the soldiers, who scrambled for cover. Garrick dragged Fari to the side, rummaging for a spare filter. The bullet had cracked her seal. She coughed violently, eyes wide. Nari placed a fresh filter over Fari's face, pressing it until it clicked in. "Hang on," she pleaded, watching Fari's chest rise as she managed another breath of sweet oxygen. Meanwhile, Teo and another rebel pinned down the guards. They signaled the all clear, and Nari and Garrick helped Fari hobble through the corridor. From there, they finally reached the rusted exit door leading back into the tunnel, slamming it shut behind them. The scuffed metal shuddered under the barrage of pounding from pursuing guards, but for now, it held. The rebels hurried through the cramped space, ducking under the mass of pipes amid flickering emergency lights. Ahead, the tunnel stretched into darkness, seemingly infinite. It was their only route out. Adrenaline propelled them. Every footstep seemed magnified in the confining passage, and every second threatened to bring fresh soldiers from the facility's alternate routes. Yet, after a tense, twisting sprint, they reached the broken grate that served as their entry point. One by one, they scrambled outside, boots pressing into the gritty soil. Once fresh air might have greeted them under an open sky, but these days only a dusty gloom awaited. Nari turned to help Teo up, then caught sight of the horizon. The lights of the fortress behind them glowed in malevolent shades of orange and red, painting the night with dread. Air raid sirens howled. All around, shadowy figures began to congregate at vantage points. She recognized some of them as ordinary civilians, come to witness the spectacle of a group daring to resist. Others might have been spies for the Tyrants. She couldn't tell. The important thing now was to flee and distribute what oxygen they had seized before the next wave of retribution. He made it back to the rebel safe house, an abandoned high-rise whose broken windows offered shelter from the caustic winds. Within a half-collapsed office suite on the 10th floor, they began unloading their newly acquired canisters. Sounds of panting filled the space as each rebel removed their masks and took short, nervous sips of air from the fresh supply. A single canister, once opened, was precious beyond measure. Tarek sank to his knees, leaning on a decrepit desk. "We did it!" he gasped, feeling equal parts relief and shock. Despite the success of the mission, he knew the Tyrants would launch a brutal crackdown. Yet seeing the silver canisters lined up against the wall filled him with renewed determination. This was only the beginning. Fari, still recovering, managed a weak smile behind her mask. Nari placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to keep going," Nari said quietly. "We've proven it can be done. People aren't powerless against them, no matter how many guns they have." As she spoke, a ragged young woman in tattered clothes stepped forward. She'd once been a volunteer nurse in the early days of the crisis, back when the regime claimed it was safeguarding oxygen for the common good. "Please," the woman asked. "My daughter has trouble breathing. Can I take one canister?" Nari nodded softly. "Of course. That's what we're here for." She carried it over and showed the woman how to attach the mask properly. Tears pooled in the mother's eyes as she realized that, for the first time in weeks, her child might breathe easily through the night. Moments like this made the risk worthwhile, but also hammered home how dire the situation remained. The rebels had only made a small dent in the Tyrants' massive stockpiles. They could celebrate briefly, but the next battle loomed. The regime responded in predictably heavy-handed fashion. The next morning, the rebels awoke to the thunder of armored vehicles rolling through the streets, accompanied by crackling proclamations through loudspeakers. Soldiers in black masks patrolled in groups, scanning passers-by for evidence of contraband oxygen. Several neighborhoods were placed under quarantine. Forces raided locations suspected of harboring stolen canisters, leading to violent clashes. Despite the chaos, the rebel safe house remained undiscovered for the moment. In broad daylight, city squares became stages for public retribution. Soldiers would drag people from their homes, forced to kneel while their respirators were removed for inspection. The slightest sign of impropriety, a missing label on their canister, an off-brand filter could lead to detention. Whispers of new execution plots circulated. Under the stifling midday glare, the regime feverishly searched for the band of rebels who dared to orchestrate the heist. No nook or cranny was safe. Still, Tomorrow's Breath took advantage of the confusion to quietly disperse smaller stashes of oxygen throughout the city, distributing canisters among grassroots networks who passed them along to the desperately ill. Nari moved between safe houses, her face always masked to hide her identity. She saw fear on everyone's faces, tempered only by the shining hope of a fresh canister. More and more people were emboldened, stepping up to help. One ex-guard who'd left the Tyrants after seeing a child suffocate in his mother's arms offered to train the rebels in infiltration techniques. He realized that saving lives meant working against the monstrous system he'd once served. Meanwhile, behind the fortified walls, the Tyrants convened a crisis meeting. Their newly appointed commander, a tall woman known only as Inquisitor Vance, demanded answers. "How many canisters have we lost?" she demanded, pacing across a sleek room lined with blinking control panels. A subordinate quickly produced a tablet displaying digital tallies. "We estimate at least 200 were taken, possibly more. The cameras were scrambled, so an exact figure isn't confirmed." Vance glowered behind her mask. "That's inconceivable. Our facility is designed to withstand any infiltration. Are you telling me we've been outmaneuvered by civilian scum?" Her voice rose, echoing in the stark chamber. The subordinate lowered his head, unsure what to say to appease her. She dismissed him with a curt gesture and turned to a group of senior officers standing nearby. "The time for half measures is over. Let the city know any further theft of oxygen supplies will be punishable by collective penalty, entire districts cut off. If they won't surrender the culprits, they can suffer together." One officer shifted uneasily. Our intelligence suggests this group is distributing the stolen canisters quickly. They don't appear to be hoarding them for profit. They're trying to—" "Don't say it," Vance snapped. "It's treason and we'll stamp it out. Send extra patrols to every populated zone, offer a bounty for information, or threaten them. I don't care which. We must maintain control." And so her orders were carried out. Mobile checkpoints appeared on every major crossroad, and sniffer drones hovered across the skyline, detecting illegal canisters by analyzing air composition. The city devolved into a tense battle. That evening, Nari gathered tomorrow's breath for a crucial meeting. Most arrived wearing stolen uniforms or civilian rags, slipping past the patrols by weaving through alleyways. Their morale was shaken by the brutality they'd witnessed, but they were determined not to falter. Tio's eyes burned with anger as he recounted how soldiers set an entire block ablaze after suspecting it of harboring rebels. "We can't let that keep happening," he urged. "They're using fear as a weapon, but we can do the same. If we can sabotage their oxygen distribution centers, force them to think they'll lose everything, we might get them to back down." A few rebels looked uncertain. "But their firepower dwarfs ours," one man pointed out. "They could crush us if we escalate." Garrick raised a hand. "We don't match them bullet for bullet," he said solemnly. "We hit them from the inside by continuing to sabotage their supply lines. They can't fight if they have no air. That's our leverage. Enough sabotage and even the soldiers will realize the regime can't keep them breathing if the people rise up." Nari, quiet until now, nodded in agreement. "We established a foothold with the canister raid. Word is spreading that they're vulnerable. If we keep hitting them, we might inspire the entire population to revolt together." She paused, meeting every gaze in the flickering lantern light. "But we have to be ready. This will be larger than a single heist." Teo's jaw stiffened. "So what's next?" "We infiltrate their central supply station, the one rumored to be miles underground, beneath the command center. If Vance is controlling the city's oxygen from down there, we'll cut off her lifeline. That might give us enough leverage to negotiate or overthrow them outright." A hush fell. It was a brazen plan, touching the nerve of what kept the Tyrants functioning. Still, heads nodded after a beat of hesitation. They had nothing to lose but empty, suffocating days under oppression. Over the next week, the rebels prepared meticulously. They mapped subterranean routes, studied guard schedules, and quietly recruited others tired of living in fear. The city was on edge. One rumor said entire platoons of soldiers had deserted rather than face potential asphyxiation if the rebels sabotaged the distribution station. Another rumor claimed the Tyrants were hoarding a secret reservoir of fresh air imported from faraway regions that still had pockets of natural atmosphere. 1,000 rumors swirled, some contradictory, all fueling the sense of a coming storm. At last, the appointed night arrived. The rebels assembled near a cratered highway overpass, then snuck through an old freight elevator shaft that led deeper than most realized the city went. Weaving past rusted metal supports, they descended into a basement-level labyrinth lit by flickering emergency lamps. In the distance, mechanical hums and occasional bursts of pressurized air indicated they were close to the main distribution hub. Tension coiled like a spring in everyone's chest. And then they saw it. An enormous subterranean chamber filled with cylindrical tanks as tall as buildings, connected by thick pipes that disappeared into the darkness beyond. Through reinforced glass windows, they glimpsed control consoles manned by uniformed technicians. This was the heart of the Tyrants' operation, a place where raw atmosphere was filtered, compressed, and routed into smaller canisters before being sent up to various outposts. Alarms remained silent for now. They hadn't been discovered yet. Garrick signaled for the squads to fan out. One group would plant explosives near the control lines, set to detonate only if negotiations broke down. Another group would override the system's main console, redirecting the precious oxygen to safer corridors that the rebels controlled. Nari and Teo took the infiltration route, creeping through service walkways and using stolen passcodes to access restricted zones. Meanwhile, the Tyrants above were oblivious to the infiltration, continuing their night patrols and scanning the streets. A sudden flurry of movement in the control room caught Neri's eye. A technician seemed to notice an irregularity on one of the monitors. He stood, peering at the readout, confusion etched on his face. Before he could alert anyone, Neri rushed in, pressing her sidearm to his chest. Their eyes locked for only a moment, understanding passing between them. She whispered, "Don't sound the alarm, or we all suffocate." Fear flickered in the man's gaze, but also a flicker of realization that maybe they weren't so different. The next hour was a blur of rapid commands, frantic reprogramming of the distribution system, and breathless tension. Eric's sabotage team successfully rigged the explosives in key places, ensuring that Vance and her officers would think twice about a direct assault. As the rebels seized control of the chamber, the technicians were herded into a corner. They were not harmed. There was no point in violence if nobody could breathe in the end. It dawned at last, piercing the gloom in faint rays that filtered through cracks in the ceiling far above. Seizing the moment, Tio adjusted the main console. Motors rumbled to life, rerouting streams of compressed oxygen into new lines. With a triumphant grin, he turned to Nari. "We're doing it! We're controlling the flow of air! This is what freedom feels like!" It was the opening salvo. Word spread like wildfire across the city that the rebels had reached the core of the oxygen network. Civilians poured into the streets, chanting for an end to the regime. Even some soldiers removed their black masks, unwilling to fire on their own neighbors. In the command center above, Inquisitor Vance scrambled to maintain order, shouting threats into comm systems that no longer responded. Her demands for reinforcements went unanswered. Many of her best-trained men had deserted or been pinned down. By mid-morning, large sections of the city had declared themselves free zones, distributing air unregulated and calling for the immediate collapse of the Tyrants' authority. The insidious hiss of respirators remained, but this time it was accompanied by the determined voices of a once submissive population finally standing as one. Forced from her fortress, Vance and a handful of loyalists barricaded themselves in an upper bunker, but with the control hub in rebel hands, she had no leverage. Stale air circulated in the sealed chambers where she huddled, gasping behind her visor. In the sprawling subterranean distribution chamber that now belonged to the rebellion, Nari removed her mask and took her first unfiltered breath in what felt like an eternity, albeit with the help of the newly rerouted oxygen lines. A wave of wonder flooded her senses. Even if it was only a temporary measure in this enclosed environment, it felt like a victory. She turned to her fellow rebels. Their eyes blazed with relief, with triumphant defiance, and with a vision of a future that no longer belonged to the Tyrants. Somewhere above, the city began to celebrate, though caution lingered like a stubborn cloud. The transition would be messy. The fight wasn't over, but the people had taken back the air. Step by step, moment by moment, they would cultivate a world where scarce oxygen wasn't a commodity of control, but a universal right. And as Neri inhaled, it tasted faintly of hope. And that was more precious than breath itself.